By the mid-1950s, one stretch of mountains 90 miles from New York City held more than 500 resorts, 50,000 bungalows, and 1 million visitors every summer. By some accounts, the densest concentration of resort hotels anywhere on Earth. Today, almost none of it exists, not as businesses, not as buildings you could point to on a map. What's left is ruins in second-growth forest, collapsed ballrooms open to the sky, empty swimming pools with birch trees rising through shattered tile. The gap between 1 million guests and an empty forest isn't one failed business. It's an industry built twice in the same mountains, and abandoned twice for entirely different reasons, a century apart. It starts with a story about a man who slept for 20 years. Washington Irving published Rip Van Winkle in 1819 and set it in the Catskills, a hazy blue range west of the Hudson, populated in his telling by the ghosts of Henry Hudson's Dutch crew, bowling ninepins in the thunder while a lazy villager slept the revolution away. Irving had barely set foot in these mountains. What he wrote anyway was a founding myth for a range that, until then, had no myth at all. Within a few years, the Catskills weren't hills west of the river. They were the wilderness, the first American landscape famous enough to draw visitors who'd never read the book that made it so. Something had to receive them. In 1824, a group of businessmen opened the Catskill Mountain House on an escarpment ledge more than 2,000 feet above the valley. The first mountain resort built anywhere in the United States. A long white building fronted by tall columns, set on the lip of a cliff with nothing beneath its porch but air, and most summer mornings cloud. It wasn't a hotel so much as a viewing platform that happened to serve dinner. Then, in 1825, a young painter came up the same river. Thomas Cole traveled toward the escarpment and began painting these mountains in roughly the register Irving had already written them in vast, older than the country that had just discovered them. The canvases became the founding documents of the Hudson River School, the first art movement America could claim entirely as its own. Frederick Church, Cole's most prominent student, climbed the ledge in 1849 and painted the view at sunrise from the hotel's own porch, the columns just visible at the frame's edge, the valley beneath drowned in white. In 30 years, a single hotel porch produced a national myth, a resort industry, and a school of painting. That made the Catskills famous. What came next made them exclusive. And that's where the story turns. By the 1880s, the Mountain House had become a fixture of American public life. 3 presidents made the climb Grant, Arthur, Roosevelt, fixing the ledge on the national map. The advertisements these hotels ran in New York papers read like ordinary resort copy. Mountain air, private baths, an orchestra on the lawn, and one more line, printed often enough to be settled house policy rather than one owner's preference. No Hebrews or consumptives. The phrase did 2 jobs in one sentence. Consumptives, tuberculosis patients, were refused rooms for fear of contagion. Hebrews were refused because they were Jewish, a category the management found equally undesirable and advertised with the same flat certainty. Beside the room rates, beside the train schedules, here's what makes that line the hinge of this entire story. New York City, in these same decades, held one of the largest Jewish populations on Earth. And the resort world 90 miles north was, by its own printed terms, closed to all of it. Those families didn't stop wanting mountains. They started looking at land nobody advertising a resort had ever thought worth mentioning. The poorer, rockier countries south and west, in Sullivan and Ulster counties. Ground too thin for the hotel trade the Hudson side had already perfected. Keep the mountain house on its ledge in mind. Its part in this isn't finished. What Exclusion built instead, on farmland nobody wanted, would take a name of its own within a generation. And that name didn't come from a lawyer, a painter, or a president. The tenements made the case for leaving on their own. Rooms stacked above streets that held the day's heat long past dark. Air that didn't move. Whole families with nowhere to go until September. Sullivan County offered rocky hillsides, poor soil, and distance from all of it. For a family that had spent a decade saving from a pushcart or a sewing machine, cheap hillsides were still hillsides. The ground gave nothing back. Whatever they planted returned less than went in, thin, glacially scraped acreage that earlier farmers had already worked out and walked away from before the immigrant families ever bought it. But a farm that can't feed the family that owns it also can't sit empty. So they rented what they had: a bedroom, a porch, a shelf in the kitchen where a second family could keep its own pots and cook its own dinner under the same roof. The arrangement got a name: the Kuchelen, Yiddish for cook it yourself. A boarding house in the loosest possible sense. No dining room, no staff, no meals. Just a bed and a shared kosher kitchen where every family cooked its own food at its own hour on its own shelf. It was, more or less, the tenement relocated 90 miles into the hills and given a view. The Ontario and Western Railway carried them up, a line that had spent decades hauling coal and milk and now found a more reliable freight riding its cars every June. Whole families with steamer trunks, coming to occupy a rented bed for a summer, riding home again in September. Within a few seasons, the Borders and the farm families had named the whole region themselves. They called it the Borscht Belt, after the beet soup ladled out in nearly every one of those shared kitchens, a joke they told about themselves before anyone outside the mountains had heard it. No founder, no plan. Just farms, families, a railway, and a soup. Selig Grossinger had already failed once running a restaurant in New York when he arrived in Sullivan County in 1914 and bought a rundown farm near Ferndale, the kind of property no city bank would lend against. No partners. No hotel experience. No plan beyond turning one failure into something else before the money ran out. He didn't build a hotel. He rented rooms in the house he already had to boarders expecting nothing grander than a bed and a kitchen shelf. The first ones paid $9 a week. Remember that number. It comes back at the end of this story, in an arrangement of zeros nobody standing on that farm in 1914 could have imagined. His daughter Jenny kept the books before she ever kept the guests, and within a few years had made herself the hostess of a farm her father still ran like a ledger. Then in 1931 the George Washington Bridge opened, and the state paved and widened Route 17 alongside it. Together they collapsed the drive from Manhattan from most of a day to a few hours behind the wheel of a Ford. Hotels rose to meet the shortened trip. Dozens, then hundreds. Brown's in Loch Sheldrake, the Novelle in Elmville. None of them needed a rail timetable anymore, just a paved road and a full tank. And here's the part that shouldn't work. They kept rising after 1929, while credit vanished from the rest of the American economy. not because anyone was prospering. A week at Exclusion still cost less than a week sweating through August in a tenement, and that math held even as wages collapsed. The Depression didn't shut the Borscht Belt down, it sent more customers. In 1935, a Russian-born barber named Arthur Winterick, who'd made a fortune on a scalp tonic, took a hotel at Kiamesha Lake in settlement of a debt. He'd never asked to run a resort. He rebuilt it in 1937 as the Concorde, and then kept building every year for 30 years. By the 1950s, more than 1 million guests filled these two counties every summer. And they didn't arrive as scattered strangers. They arrived as neighborhoods. Whole blocks moved together. Whole buildings emptied together. Entire synagogue congregations relocated to the same corner of the mountains for 8 weeks. So a family renting a bungalow in July found half its own apartment building renting the bungalows on either side. This wasn't tourism. It was closer to seasonal migration. The same neighborhoods reassembling themselves 90 miles from home, year after year, until the mountains had their own version of the streets the guests had left. The city didn't send visitors to the Catskills. It sent itself, one summer at a time. The fathers stayed behind Monday through Thursday, working the jobs that paid for it. Friday evening, they drove. Route 17 filled every week with men who'd spent 5 days alone in a hot apartment, heading north in the last daylight. The traffic became the clock the whole region set its week by, thin on Tuesday, solid by 6 on Friday. Locals had a name for them. Not unkind, just accurate. Bungalow bachelors. What waited at the larger hotels ran on one arrangement, the American plan. 3 meals a day. Kosher, enormous, included. Look at what that actually was. The Kuchline had been 4 families rationing a burner on a schedule chalked above a shared stove. The American plan was that same memory turned inside out and sold back as the entire point of the trip. Nobody cooked. Nobody shared a shelf. Abundance wasn't a feature of the stay. Abundance was the product. Nobody sold it at greater scale than Grossinger's. At its peak, 35 buildings across 1,200 acres, 150,000 guests a year, its own post office, its own airstrip, seating for 1,300 people eating at once, 3 times a day, all summer. In 1952, it became the first resort in the world to cover a ski slope in artificial snow. Manufacturing in February, the one commodity these mountains had never needed help producing in July. Picture Ferndale on a Friday evening that year. Sedans turning up the drive past a post office already closed, and an airstrip lit by the last of the sun. Dining room windows going bright in blocks as the staff sets 1,300 places. Brisket moving across the lawn on the evening air, a farm no bank would lend against 40 years earlier. What Jenny Grossinger built from her father's ledger was closer to a court, and she was its permanent hostess. Rocky Marciano trained on her grounds, running the mountain roads before dawn, until the resort's name became shorthand in the boxing press for a training camp of real consequence. A teenage Eddie Fisher sang for the guests, and was heard by someone who mattered. A kind of Discovery Catskill hotels would claim for a dozen careers over the next decade, with varying accuracy. Grossinger's had stopped being a place people escaped to. It was a place careers passed through. A few miles down the road at Kiamesha Lake, Winterick was still building. By the 1950s, the Concorde covered 2,000 acres, offered 1,500 rooms, and could seat 3,000 people at a single dinner service, enough to make Grossinger's 1,300 look modest. He cut a golf course into the hillside and named it the Monster. The name held, golfers ranked it among the hardest in the country. A deliberate, engineered cruelty laid into a resort otherwise built entirely on comfort. Every time the Concorde ran short of rooms or stage time, Winneric's answer was identical. Another wing, another floor, another act. It didn't grow by plan. It grew by reflex for 30 straight years. Not everyone chased that. In Thompson, the Kutcher family ran their hotel as a single household business, passed down 3 generations without ever changing hands. And it was at Kutcher's in the early 1950s that a lanky Philadelphia teenager carried suitcases for tips, a bellhop, who, in the hours he wasn't working, was unbeatable on the hotel's outdoor court. His name was Wilt Chamberlain. Every hotel of any size also employed a figure the region called the tumbler, from the Yiddish for commotion, whose entire job was keeping guests laughing from the pool deck at 10 in the morning to the nightclub floor past midnight. Because the dining rooms fed 1 million guests a summer, the nightclubs behind them fed something else, an entire generation's sense of what was funny, rehearsed nightly for an audience that had already eaten, had nowhere else to go, and expected to be entertained until the small hours. Sid Caesar picked up a saxophone in a Catskill hotel band as a teenager. Jerry Lewis bussed tables, clearing plates from rooms where his own parents were performing that same evening. Mel Brooks worked the circuit. Joan Rivers worked the circuit. Rodney Dangerfield worked it too, each one sharpening an act in front of the same unforgiving crowd of garment workers and their wives, people who'd paid for comfort and would not sit politely through a joke that missed. These mountains didn't discover comedians. They manufactured them on a nightly schedule in rooms too small to hide a bad set. Comic, then singer, then dancing, then a midnight buffet for guests who'd eaten at 7 and would eat again before bed. 2 shows a night, every night, all season. The lights over Kiamesha Lake didn't go dark before 4 in the morning. Proxine Tortage and Reddens, when they yo quietly, the reasons the Borscht Belt existed began to dissolve. No hotel closed to mark the moment. No headline announced it. Sullivan County historian John Conway later reduced the whole unraveling to 3 words. Each worked on it, and not one of them required a single hotel to fail a single booking before the damage began. Air conditioning came first, bolted into city windows through the 1950s and 60s. For 2 generations, escaping the heat of a Lower East Side walk-up had been the entire premise of the trip north, the reason for the Cuchulainn, the reason for the Friday drive, the reason the migration existed at all. Once a window unit did the same job for a monthly bill, escaping the heat no longer required a mountain. Airfare did the second piece. Cheap jet service put Miami Beach a few hours away, the Caribbean within an afternoon, Europe within reach of a 2-week vacation for families who'd never been able to afford distance. A week in the mountains now had to compete with a week anywhere on Earth, and the Catskills couldn't manufacture an ocean. Assimilation finished it, and this is the part with the bitter symmetry. The same prejudice that once printed no Hebrews or consumptives beside the room rates receded through the middle of the century. The resorts that had built that policy into their advertising began, one by one, to welcome the guests they'd turned away. The Borscht Belt existed because Jewish families were shut out everywhere else. When those doors opened, the reason for a separate resort world walked out through them. Children raised on the American plan, now doctors, lawyers, professors, took their vacations at hotels that had refused their parents a room. And as women entered the workforce through the 1960s and 1970s, the season-long family stay lost the one arrangement that had ever made it possible. Now go back to the ledge. On the morning of January 25th, 1963, the state of New York, which had acquired the derelict Catskill Mountain House years earlier, set the empty building on fire and let it burn above the frozen valley. No ceremony, no crowd. A work crew, a match, and a wooden hulk nobody had run as a hotel in decades, standing where Cole and Church had painted. The first resort built in America ended as a controlled burn on a winter morning. By afternoon, there was nothing on the escarpment but the ledge. 6 years later, these mountains drew the largest crowd they ever had, and it had nothing to do with the kosher dining room. In August 1969, 500,000 young people arrived at a dairy farm in Bethel, Sullivan County, for a festival named after a town 40 miles away. They'd come looking for an escape their parents' hotels had never learned how to sell. They found it down the road. The hotels were still standing. What no longer stood was any reason for them to. They went in order. Small first, the 20-room Catskills, which had never installed air conditioning because air conditioning had never been the point. Then the mid-sized houses that filled 100 rooms in 1955 and couldn't fill 40 by 1970. Then, eventually, the famous names. Jenny Groschinger died in 1972 on the grounds of the resort. Her father had opened as a $9 a week boarding house 58 years earlier. She didn't live to see it close. In 1986, the family sold the hotel for $9 million, and the dining room that once set 1,300 places shut for good. $9 a week in 1914, $9 million in 1986. That distance isn't inflation. Inflation doesn't turn a boarding house into 35 buildings across 1,200 acres. It's the entire arc of this story compressed into a coincidence of digits. Nobody arranged the record, simply happens to contain it. 1 year later, a film called Dirty Dancing made a fictional version of these hotels permanent in American memory, playing forever on screen, a resort that had already closed before a single frame was shot. The Concorde held out longest. Weinerich's answer to every problem had always been another wing, and the hotel he built that way ran until 1998, outlasting Grossinger's by 12 years on scale alone. It sold at auction in 1999 for roughly $10 million, a fraction of what went into it. It stood empty another decade and came down in 2008. Kutcher's outlasted them both, closing in 2013, the last operating grand resort of the Borscht Belt, run by one family for over a century. The buildings came down the following year. Grossinger's stood empty for 30 years, and in that time became one of the most photographed ruins in the United States, not despite the decay, because of it. The indoor pool with birch trees through the shattered skylight, ballroom's carpeted floor to cornice in moss. Demolition crews leveled the last building on October 19, 2018. That same year, a casino called Resorts World Catskills opened on the old Concorde grounds, built at a reported cost of $1.2 billion. A bet that gambling could revive what vacationing built and a jet engine unbuilt. And every July, the bungalow colonies fill again. The families are Hasidic and Orthodox now in South Fallsburg in Kiamesha Lake, in Monticello, keeping roughly the same schedule of summer migration that a different set of Jewish families kept a century ago. The hotels that once printed no, Hebrews beside their room rates are gone. The land they stood on belongs, every summer, to the people it was built to keep out. High above the Hudson, the ledge where the mountain house stood for 139 years is bare rock now, inside a state campground. The wind still crosses it the way it crossed those porch columns in 1849. The valley below still vanishes into cloud on a summer morning and returns by noon, exactly as it did for Cole, for Church, for Grant and Arthur and Roosevelt. Every hotel in this story is gone. The view charges nothing and answers to no one. It's the only thing here that never closed.